hello again, OCR A-level history students who are doing Britain between 1930 and 1997. I promised you a second video, and here it is, probably a bit quicker than you thought it would be. But anyway, here we go. This one is going to be on appeasement and German expansionism, as promised. So let's get straight into it. So, appeasement. Post-World War One, obviously Britain, Europe, Germany, the world in a bit of a state, and there was arguments about whether or not Britain should be rearming, nations should be rearming, whether or not we should be trying to come up with some sort of peace within Europe just to ensure that a war like that would never ever happen. And this is one of the four things that we look at when we look at Churchill's Wilderness, mainly because of his views on appeasement and views on German expansionism don't really match what the public and also what the government are putting forward. So a bit of detail about appeasement. So end of the First World War, it is argued, seen as that there was a bit of a reliance on protection of the Treaty of Versailles, League of Nations, and the Locarno Pact. So the Treaty of Versailles obviously put restrictions in place on Germany that would restrict them from potentially ever getting into a position where they were able to do what they've just done in World War One. So obviously economic sanctions, paying money back to nations, restricting the amount of land they had, and also restricting the army, navy, etc. that they were allowed to build up. And argument that Britain and France and other nations relied a little bit too much on this protection of the treaty because we thought, well, what's the point in building up a new army? We don't need one because everything's going to be all right. No one's going to do anything like this again. Obviously, the League of Nations in 1920 as well put together, which basically meant that the nations that were part of it felt as though there was no war imminent. So again, there would be no reason for us to build up any sort of army to protect ourselves. And also the Locarno Pact put in place this idea that if the Germans were a bit worried about their own futures and their own land, etc., this Locarno Pact, this agreement between all of these nations, Italy, France, Belgium, Britain, etc., and Germany, obviously, that the borders that were set up at the end of the with the Treaty of Versailles, they would actually stay fixed, and that no one could actually attack or go into this land that was now Germany's. And this obviously put the Germans at a bit more ease, which would mean that they were less likely to get angry and then potentially create some sort of further kind of military action. Another reason why we could argue that there was no need to rebuild our armed forces would be the Anglo-German Naval Treaty in 1935, basically, which allowed Germany to build up a navy, but it had to be around about 30 to 35% of the size of the British Navy. So always meaning that they were around about a third of the size of us, which would give us naval superiority. So again, Germany weren't allowed to have that much of a navy, so then they were no threat. And then we've got the 10-year rule, which was something that basically said that we didn't anticipate that we'd ever go to war in the next 10 years, therefore we don't need to build up any sort of armed force. Now, how does this put Churchill and the government in opposition? This links to expansionism, which we look at on the next slide, obviously. Basically, government views and actions were that they believed that they could negotiate to reduce the danger with Britain rather than, flexing our power muscles. Look at the size of our army and navy, etc. You don't want to mess with us. They believe that it would be much better to have a negotiated agreement, and this would reduce the danger for Britain. There was also major concerns with the public, which the government were aware of. The public had just been in a war that had a major impact on their lives, and the public didn't want to go to war and have action again. Linked to this is the post-war economy and society. We're trying to rebuild Britain, and the analogy that I like to use is that if you think about your house, Churchill, I suppose, the way that he went against what was being said with this post-war economy and society, was that the government want to make sure that Britain was all good and nice and done up, so nice wallpaper, nice sofas and stuff. Stick with this analogy, yeah. But Churchill was thinking, well, what's the point in having a really nice interior if someone's standing outside chucking bricks through your windows? We need to deal with that first. But obviously, the British public didn't want that. They wanted their homes, they wanted their lives, they wanted employment. And the government believed that we needed to make Britain economically more secure and rebuild Britain again. And this would obviously be more beneficial than spending money on rearming. There was also opposition support of sorts, in that Labour believed that they didn't want any action. They believed that we should be having negotiations, but their negotiations should be maybe about setting the stronger view. This is what you are going to do, rather than come to some sort of agreement actually saying, right, this is what you are going to do. All of this led to the Munich Agreement, basically, in 1938. Yes, there's stuff about Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, etc., which we'll look at when it comes to expansionism. But this Munich Agreement shows that Chamberlain and the government wanted to negotiate with Adolf Hitler, the Nazis in Germany. Churchill's views, quite simple. We should be rearming. We should not leave ourselves vulnerable. As it says nicely on the last slide, appeasers are basically people who believe that, I'll put it up for you actually, that one who feeds a crocodile hoping it will eat him last. So by allowing Germany to have all of this freedom, etc., that the inevitable was going to happen, that there was going to be expansionism and attacks, but because we're being nice to them, then we'll be the last people who they will turn on. He believed we should have a stronger air force. He believed that we should definitely have a stronger navy. He believed that we should be preparing ourselves for a danger. Ultimately, he was correct. But also he believed that we should have a grand alliance, that if we work together with the strongest nations in the world, then there would be less willing from Hitler to get involved in anything, but also that we would probably have to rearm a bit less. So then maybe that's one way of getting around the whole issue with the public, but also strengthen numbers. Now, the problem is that Russia weren't really that interested. They had their own issues, they had their own things, and also Churchill wasn't really a big fan of Stalin and communism. So why would you want to sign an agreement with someone who's basically just said that Russia is a terrible place to be and the Russian leader is a terrible person? And then the Americans had a policy of isolationism. They did not want to get involved in something that was so far away from their land that would affect them, and their public didn't want to get involved in another war as well. So there's some basic information about how that put Churchill in the wilderness. Last thing we're going to look at is German expansionism. Now, obviously, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, they were not allowed to do anything like this. However, that didn't stop them. So as you can see there is a timeline of 4 key things that happen between March 1936 and September of 1939. All of these things created a major issue, particularly the remilitarization of Rhineland, which broke specific terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And breaking this buffer zone between France and Germany was seen as quite an aggressive move. And obviously that this shouldn't be done. However, Baldwin at this time was saying that the public didn't want to get involved in a war and that they wouldn't support military action. So we are just going to wait and see. This was a buffer zone, and technically nothing really that bad has happened. Then we move on to the Anschluss with Austria. And this is obviously a signed agreement with Austria. So again, do you get involved with people who you have agreements with? If is it our place to say you can't do this when it's Austria? Could have easily have not got involved with anything potentially. This was seen as a major triumph for Germany though, because obviously it starts weakening Britain and France, who basically protested, but it showed that there was a building of strength of Germany and no one was doing anything about it. This was really the point when Churchill wanted this Grand Alliance, and he started to see that this was something that was going to really be a big issue. Then we've got the annexation of Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, etc. So Hitler successfully took over Sudetenland in the September. Basically justifying this because there were around about between 3 and 4 million German-speaking people living in Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia as a result of the new boundaries and barriers that were created after World War One. And this was a part of a policy, and I'm terrible at pronouncing this, Lebensraum, which was about reuniting and reunifying Germans and German-speaking people and looking after these people. Czechoslovakia was basically crippled by this, and as a result of it, weren't able to really support themselves. And Hitler took this as an opportunity to basically annex, which they did in the March of 39. And the last main bit that we look at with German expansionism is potentially the straw that breaks the camel's back, and that's September 39, and that's the invasion of Poland. So obviously the loss of Danzig and the Polish corridor was a major issue at the end of the Treaty of Versailles, and the Germans did not like this, Hitler particularly. And so the invasion of Poland was to reclaim land that they believed was rightfully theirs. This invasion then led to Chamberlain declaring war on Germany. So in terms of German expansionism and how this led to a wilderness of Churchill to the rest of the government were very concerned, as I mentioned in the previous slide, on a rearmament, about action. They didn't want to get involved. And if you think about remilitarization of Rhineland, if you think about the Anschluss of Austria, if you think about annexation even of Czechoslovakia, technically there's nothing really to be done. You could argue that the annexation of Czechoslovakia was something that was maybe invited. And you could also argue, well, all Hitler's doing is actually trying to repatriate these German-speaking people as part of this policy. So there's nothing really to be done. The Czechoslovakia thing as well, it's interesting to see what the British government's views on this are, because this is what led to the Munich Agreement in 1938, obviously. In that, basically, this agreement more or less just give Hitler Czechoslovakia. Churchill wanted us to do more in Czechoslovakia. He believed that it was our responsibility to go to war with France, who obviously wanted to build this grand alliance with as well, were really not wanting to get part of this, and mainly because they were recovering from a war themselves, but also because it was far enough away not to really concern them. They were more bothered about what was happening maybe in Rhineland and also the bordering areas with France. Churchill believed that we should be building this grand alliance to show strength against the Germans, but as mentioned in the previous slide, there's reasons why people wouldn't want to do that. In terms of the Munich Agreement, he again made speeches in the House of Commons in which he was shouted down and seen as being very much isolated. And in returning from the Munich Agreement with our peace in our time view that Chamberlain put forward, Churchill believed that we were given a choice between war and dishonor, and by agreeing and appeasing with Hitler, what we had done is chosen dishonor, and we should have gone to war. History tells us, as hindsight tells us, that maybe we should have acted earlier, and this could have all been prevented, and that I wouldn't even be having to teach you this. But unfortunately, we didn't, and Churchill was proven on this occasion to be right. Okay, that was our run-through revision of the final two parts of reasons why Churchill was in the political wilderness, and that is appeasement and expansionism. As ever, leave a comment below if you have any questions, have anything else you want to say. Subscribe so you get these as they come through. We will be moving on to Churchill becoming war prime minister in the next videos, and they will be with you hopefully within the next week. In the meantime, stay safe, look after yourselves, look after each other, protect the NHS, and see you all soon.